In order to research this video, I've read hundreds of exam answers marked by senior examiners. Then I've put them into a series of guides. This has forced me to work out what are the secret ingredients that make up each essay at each grade. So let's dive inside and I'll show you what I've discovered. We're going to read a grade 6 and a grade 9 answer, but first, the secret ingredients. Grade 5 and 6 essays tend to have the same number of words, about 580 to 600 words. But grade 5 essay won't bother with a thesis statement, and you'll see what that is later if you don't know, whereas a grade 6 one will. They'll both have about 10 explanations in. I'll show you what explanations look like. They'll both use about 10 quotes, and they will both write about the author's methods, and they'll name about 2 of them, not very many at all. You'll notice a big difference here in the amount of context that students give. So a grade 5 essay will only have 2 instances of context, whereas a grade 6 will have 4. The context is vital because it helps you explain the author's purpose. The author's purpose is what is going to get you the grade 6 instead of the grade 5. Then we jump to the conclusion, and students writing at grade 5 tend not to write a conclusion, but at grade 6 they do. Why is the conclusion important? Because it links us back to the author's purpose again. Our question comes from the June 2019 paper, and it is about the violence of Macbeth's character. Here's the extract for you to look at your leisure. We are going to read a grade 6 answer that is only 355 words long. So we begin with a thesis statement which attempts to give Shakespeare's idea. This tale of sound and fury reveals Macbeth's tragedy. So that's his first idea. Disrupting the great chain of being and challenging divine rule leads to a cycle of violence. So the student has identified why Shakespeare is exploring violence in order to show that it's because of disrupting the great chain of being and assassinating the king. Now the student dives into the extract. The captain describes Macbeth as brave Macbeth in his bloody execution of MacDonald. Macbeth is seen as superior because he has managed to kill a Thane. The phrase bloody execution reveals his ruthlessness and his violent nature. Bloody foreshadows how Macbeth will be drawn towards committing evil acts. The student means in the future. So our named method is foreshadows, and a word that shows us there's an explanation is reveals. So you explain what the quote means or shows us. This, of course, is another explanation about what bloody shows us. Now, the more explanations you have, the higher your mark. Macbeth killed MacDonald and then fixed his head upon our battlements. This public display suggests, and that tells us another explanation is coming, that he enjoys violence. To Duncan and his nobles, this is seen as heroic. However, his actions appear boastful. This suggests he uses violence in order to hide his insecurities. So here we have another explanation about what this quote means, but we've also got an explanation about how Duncan and other people would see that quote. So we've got 2 explanations. Now the student goes on to see where violence happens elsewhere in the play. We come to loathe Macbeth as we meet his later actions. He begins as a valiant and noble character, but ends as a paranoid coward. He imagines himself caught in blood once he has murdered Duncan. We realise he feels so much guilt that he will never feel at peace when he tells us the Thane of Cawdor and Glamis should sleep no more. So we have 2 quotes here, and we've got 2 explanations, one for each. Now we're going to go on to a second explanation about In Blood. Now this doesn't mean that the student is more intelligent and therefore deserves a higher mark because they're finding more than one thing to say about In Blood. Instead, the examiner is just really looking for the number of explanations you bring to convince them with your argument. So you might have a new quote and a new explanation, or another explanation about the same quote. It doesn't matter which. Being caught in blood also implies that he will always be corrupt and his character is permanently damaged. This is why the witches say something wicked is coming towards them as Macbeth comes to see them. So, this ability to link from one quote to another is a really good skill. The student is saying the witches are calling Macbeth wicked, and that is proof that Macbeth has been permanently damaged by his violence and therefore being caught in blood. They are a supernatural influence and disturb the natural order. This means that their words are ironic. The witches are known to be evil and inhuman, yet they see Macbeth as particularly wicked. This portrays him as destructive. So this word destructive links back to the violence of the question, which is why it scores marks. And then we have this very brief conclusion. Macbeth's ambition is his hamartia, and this leads him towards violence, which inevitably ends in his death. So the student is suggesting that Macbeth is punished because of this hamartia and punished with death because he has turned to violence and used that violence against his own king. We can see the one other named method that the student has used in addition to foreshadowing, and that is irony. And the underlined parts of the essay show us where the student is using context to explain Shakespeare's viewpoint. So we've got hamartia, we've got the idea of disturbing the natural order, which fits with the idea of divine rule of kings and the disruption of the great chain of being. Another important thing to notice is where the quotes come from. So the student began with the extract, but then has moved elsewhere in the play, and in particular with this idea of I am in blood stepped in so far, and by the pricking of my thumbs something wicked this way comes. The student is also picking quotes from the end of the play, and that's important because it shows the examiner that they're dealing with the whole play. When we jump into the mark scheme, you can see that the examiners want you to write about the whole text. And so making sure you include the ending or something from towards the end is a winner. We can also argue that picking quotes from the end also makes your references more effective. Amazingly, you only needed about 2 named methods to get into grade 6. And the key thing in your language analysis is to show how it links back to the meaning in the question, which here was violence. And AO3 clearly links the context to the ideas and perspectives of the author, in this case Shakespeare. Okay, now let's go to the shortest full mark answer to the same question. We begin with the thesis statement. I always recommend that students do this in 3 parts. In this extract, Shakespeare focuses on Macbeth's violence. This emphasises his bravery, which is lauded by others. That is the first part of the thesis statement. It also introduces the theme of masculinity, equating it to violence. That's the second part. And then our third part, Macbeth's final downfall, is also foreshadowed in this extract. So having 3 parts to your thesis effectively works as an essay plan and tells the examiner what you're going to focus on in your essay. All of these 3 things will be linked to Shakespeare's ideas. Shakespeare portrays Macbeth's violence as gruesome as he unseamed him from the knave to the chaps. He appears to rip MacDonald apart. Perhaps this emphasises the excessive violence Macbeth uses, in excess of that needed to kill his enemy. So look out for these words in italics. These are the ones that show us an explanation is coming, and so it's easy for you to see how many explanations are needed in a grade 9 essay. This foreshadows how excessively violent he becomes later. So you can see that trick of comparing something in the extract to something elsewhere in the play as quickly as possible is going to get you marks for dealing with the whole text, which you remember is AO1. We see this clearly when Macbeth then fixed his head upon our battlements, because Macbeth's head is also displayed this way at the end. So this is a really cunning grade 9 idea. Remember, I told you how important it is to show the examiner you're dealing with the whole text, and I taught you the trick of writing about quotes that happen much later. This student at grade 9 realizes that they can go straight to the very end, and they've noticed this cyclical structure where Macbeth gets his head put on the battlements at the end, which is what Macbeth does to MacDonald at the beginning. This cyclical ending implies that violence must lead to a destructive cycle, and how Macbeth's own violence led to his downfall. So that is one of Shakespeare's big ideas that he wants to use to explain to the audience how dangerous it is to turn their violence against their own king. We have these named methods already of theme, foreshadowed, foreshadows, and cyclical ending. By the way, you can steal all of those because they're going to be relevant to every essay title that comes up. However, at the beginning, Shakespeare presents Macbeth's violence as both brave and noble. The sergeant describes the battle in epic terms, so that he claims brave Macbeth, well, he deserves that name. This helps us understand the relationship between violence and brave masculinity. So the student is saying here that violence is celebrated in this society, and that's why Macbeth is given this praise as brave Macbeth in response to his violence. So in this question, your tactic is always to jump as soon as possible from the extract outside to the rest of the play. And the student does that here by thinking, okay, how does Lady Macbeth see violence? And the student is thinking about being filled from the crown to the top full of direst cruelty. They don't remember that quote though, but they do remember the unsex me part, which links to the idea of masculinity. So Lady Macbeth associates masculinity with violence and supernatural spirits to unsex me. Next, she manipulates Macbeth to murder Duncan by insulting his masculinity as insufficiently violent. Now the examiners are happy for you to make references to the text. The student hasn't remembered the quote where Lady Macbeth insults Macbeth, that he's like the cat in the adage, and that does not matter. The student has still got full marks because they've pointed out something that happens in the play and used it to back up their arguments. Now, at the end of the paragraph, the student comes to Shakespeare's purpose in this. Linking violence to regicide could imply that Shakespeare views masculinity as toxic. So if we jump to the top of the mark scheme, you can see that the student is exploring Shakespeare's perspective about the context of the time, masculinity at the time. Remember I told you about this skill of jumping from the extract to the rest of the play. So the student is now going back and thinking, right, where else do I see this bravery elsewhere in the play? Brave Macbeth also reveals that Macbeth feels most at home in battle because he can express his violence without having to justify the morality of his brutality. This is repeated in Act 5 when he fights Macduff, still brave even though he knows he will be killed. So you remember this when first he decides not to fight Macduff, but then he says, "Lay on Macduff and damned be him who first cries, hold enough." Again, that quote would have helped the student, but they don't need it. They still get 30 marks out of 30 because the examiner knows that's the part of the play that the student is writing about. He becomes once more the noble warrior we met in Act 1. Remember that skill of always going to the ending as well to show you're writing about the whole text. Here the student goes to the end of Macbeth's life. The significance of brave Macbeth would intrigue the Jacobean audience, as Shakespeare has first introduced us to the witches who have already told us that Macbeth is their target. The audience wonder how the brave and noble Macbeth can be corrupted by evil. So the student has jumped from the ending straight back to the beginning. This isn't a very logical way to write an essay, but it is one that's going to get you marks. The examiner is simply looking for you to jump from the extract to anywhere else in the play that's relevant. This scores some quite high marks because the student has noticed a structural feature. Why Shakespeare has introduced Macbeth first through the evil of the witches before we find out his bravery in battle. It's obviously because we are supposed to question that bravery. This extract also introduces the motif of blood as Macbeth's sword smoked with bloody execution. This portrays Macbeth's violence as skillful, noble and necessary, wielded for a just cause. This motif soon comes to represent Macbeth's guilt. He sees it as symbolic of his own crimes when he observes, "I'm in blood, stepped so far." So again, we can see this structural idea gives us a structural method, here a motif. It's an idea you can steal because the play is full of blood and blood is going to be relevant to any question. And hopefully you're getting used to the idea by now. The student finds a quote from the extract and then thinks, oh, what can I link that to? Where is blood mentioned elsewhere? Oh yes, when he decides to go off and kill Macduff's family, and he justifies it by saying he's in a river of blood, he stepped in it so far that returning were as tedious as go over. To get the marks, the student has to link this to meaning, and that's why the student says yes, it shows Macbeth's guilt, which is true. So I hope you can see how this student's mind is working. Jump from the extract elsewhere all the time and just pick keywords in the quote that remind you of keywords elsewhere. In the extract, this violence is portrayed as an art form, as their art. In contrast, the simile as two spent swimmers that do cling together implies that this art of violence will lead to his tragedy. Shakespeare also uses personification to link violence and fate with disdaining fortune. This is ironic as it implies Macbeth can overcome his fate, yet his violent acts are going to lead directly to his tragic fate. Okay, it's worth pointing out that the student is actually wrong here, but that doesn't matter. They still score 30 out of 30. This is not an example of personification because fortune is not disdaining Macbeth. Macbeth is disdaining, in other words, ignoring, disrespecting fortune, fate, by entering this battle. In other words, the sergeant is saying, look, Macbeth should have been killed here, the odds were against him, but he didn't care, he kept on fighting against the fate that seemed inevitable. Now this bit is correct. Macbeth does believe he can overcome his fate at the beginning, and it seems to him that he does. He shouldn't have been able to beat the Norwegian army, but he does. Now this leads directly to his fate at the end of the play, because he thinks that he can overcome the fate laid out by the witches of not being killed by someone born of a woman, and of challenging their prophecy that Banquo's sons will become king. To conclude, this extract portrays Macbeth as inherently violent, but shows how his violence is used in a noble cause rather than for personal ambition. This also portrays masculinity as inherently violent. We must also remember the context of the gunpowder plot. Shakespeare's play could be a cautionary tale warning that violence will turn on the violent, leading to the fate of their own destruction. So notice how the conclusion goes back to the three ideas set out in the thesis statement. This idea also that the play is a cautionary tale warning the nobles at court is always one that you could steal and should do. In my guide I show you the scores on the doors, as it were, how the student has done in those various elements. Then I give you my comments, which you've just had in the video, and then the examiner comments, what they actually wrote on the actual exam paper. So the examiner says this essay is well structured. It explores ideas all the time through several parts of the play. It develops a very effective argument. How does it do that? By using lots of references. In other words, linking to other parts of the play. It links the the structure of the play to ideas as well for level 5. So remember the order in which we meet Macbeth through the witches, and also the idea of the motif of blood. Those were structural points. By the time the student writes about toxic masculinity and Macbeth's role as a soldier, the ideas are firmly into level 6, which is where grade 9 lives. These essays come from my guide, but I'm scrolling through my Substack, a newsletter that I send out every week to students who want to get top grades. And if that sounds like you, the newsletter is totally free. And there's a link in the description. So far there are 18 resources on the themes of Macbeth and 7 on the characters. It has nearly every text that you study, as well as everything you need for the language exam. The next video I recommend for you is a grade 9 essay on Macbeth. It's the one coming up now.